Hello, everyone. Professor Cornish here. Welcome to our presentation today on uses of force. Now, we're going to be talking about force that's used in the criminal justice system by law enforcement, by corrections, both institutional, like in your prisons and jails, as well as community-based, like what your probation and parole officers, pretrial services officers will be using. Also, in this presentation, the force that we're going to be talking about will also apply to private security, such as hospital security, your campus security. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, just to give a definition of force, it's contact with the subject conducted by law enforcement or correctional personnel, also private security, that exceeds routine and procedural contact. Now, your routine or procedural contact will be handcuffing. If the person isn't resisting, it'll be your regular handcuffing. Performing pat searches, if you're having to escort someone that's handcuffed, touching their arm, guiding them as you're doing the escort. That's all routine. So force is anything that's outside of that routine. And it's generally utilized to effect an arrest or another objective. Now, force, especially whether it's physical force, chemical agents, conductive devices like shock shields, tasers, batons, etc., it is only used when necessary to overcome and stop resistance, as well as gain compliance of the subject. You know, they're resisting whether they're doing dead weight or they're hitting you. So it's only used when absolutely necessary. And it's used to stop, like with physical force, to stop the subject's physical resistance. Now, I'm saying subject because it could be a member of the public. It could be someone you're trying to arrest. It could be like in a jail, a pretrial detainee. It could be an inmate, a probationer, parolee, etc. So there's a lot of different terms. That's why I'm using subject. Just think of it as the person the officer is using force against. Now, there are a few purposes of force: to effect an arrest and to gain compliance with a legal demand or directive. So you're giving what's called a legitimate request, meaning one that you're allowed to do that's not considered unreasonable, that's not considered improper. To protect persons and property from theft, intentional damage, or injury. To protect oneself from the harms at the hands of another person. Now, like deadly force, for example, in most cases, it's only authorized when there is threat or has actually, this has occurred, serious bodily injury or death to yourself or another. Now, by serious bodily injury, that's injuries that are pretty serious, that depending upon the severity of the injury, it could end up causing death. So we have in the graphic, you have situational use of force, and then the three different types. Compliance measures, either you're trying to arrest them, you're trying to escort them, get them to lock down in their cell, whatever. Protective measures, you're protecting against injury to yourself or another, possible threat or damage occurring, and then to protect yourself from being harmed. Now, there are some common techniques that are utilized. Now, granted, the exact verbiage, the exact labels, they're going to vary depending on what system the department uses. There's different defensive tactic systems that are currently used in the criminal justice field. The big ones are PPCT, pressure point control techniques, and Krav Maga. And there are a few others that are in the field, but PCT and Krav are the two main ones. But even though system to system, the names are going to vary, the maneuvers that you do, your control techniques are going to fall into one of these categories. Now, as you can see, the first three control techniques, you're not using any force at all. The first one being officer presence. You being on scene in your uniform, you identifying yourself, you showing your badge, you identifying yourself as law enforcement or corrections or security. Sometimes when you have a situation, you just being there and identifying yourself, that can quell it. Oh crap, the cops are here. We need to stop. Your next level is verbal direction. You giving commands or directions. You giving this subject orders to comply. Like telling them if you're going to arrest them, turn around, put your hands behind your back. If they're starting to resist, hey, stop resisting. You need to calm it down. Or depending on the situation, hey, I can see you're upset. I want to be able to help you, but I need you to calm down a bit. So with verbal direction, you also have verbal de-escalation techniques. In most cases, your presence on scene and you giving that verbal direction, those are going to be your go-tos. Now, there's going to be some situations where these are not going to be your first steps. Like if you come on a scene and you've got one person assaulting another person severely to where there is going to be serious bodily injury, you may just say, stop that. And you're just going to get in and go. Or like a school shooting, for example, because most school shootings start to finish under 10 minutes when officers get on scene because of the short time frame and the matter of you could have a lot of lives lost within a short time. The initial officers on scene get into the building, start searching for the person. And if that person has already caused serious bodily injury or death to others within the school, or they've made attempts, the law enforcement responding, they're not going to stop and try to talk the person down. They're going to immediately go for lethal force. So there are situations where officer presence, verbal direction, they're going to be left to the wayside. It's really a case-by-case basis. Now, the next level of control techniques is the threat of force. If a person's being resistant and they're like in a low level of resistance, you need to stop resisting or I'm going to be using force against you. Or if somebody, let's say they've got a firearm, they haven't shot anyone yet. Law enforcement, yes, they're going to draw their weapons and they're going to say, put the weapon down. Them having their weapons drawn, that's that threat of force. And they may even say, drop your weapon or I'll shoot. So you could see all three of these, you being on scene and verbals. In some cases with the verbals, you can get the situation resolved before you have to use physical force. Now we're going to start going into physical force. And as I said before, the exact labels of this are going to vary depending upon what system it is. But pretty much every technique in a system is going to be fitting into these categories. So as far as physical force, your first level is soft empty hand control. So you don't have anything in your hands, but it includes strength techniques like your joint locks, using pressure points or knee strikes, which knee strikes, they're commonly used as like a distraction technique, as well as, you know, you give somebody a good knee strike, they're dropping to the ground. But soft empty hand control is used when verbal directions, they're not working. They're also used to design to defend against passive resistance as well as defensive resistance. Now, they can cause pain, so you're gaining compliance from the subject by pain, but with soft empty hand control techniques, little to no potential of injury. You might have a little bit of bruising, and that's it. Your next level is hard empty hand control. Now, these includes kicks, hand strikes with closed fists, the shoulder pin restraint, which some departments, with what happened with George Floyd, and at the time, the neck restraint that the Minneapolis PD had authorized, some departments have totally abandoned all neck restraints or anything that looks like a neck restraint. So there are some departments, if they have something like the shoulder pin, they're not using it anymore. But the hard empty hand control techniques, you know, they are harder. You're using, if you're doing a hand strike, it's normally closed fist. You know, kicks, you're going to be doing a kick a lot harder. They're designed to control active aggression, you know, that person actually fighting, but can also be used to control defensive resistance when your lower levels, like your verbal direction isn't working, your soft empty hand isn't working, where they've either failed or you believe it's going to fail. Higher chance that you're going to injure somebody. So most commonly, you're going to have bruises, you might have contusions and lacerations. They're not going to be bad. Now, next you have intermediate weapons. Now, there's a lot that comes into this category. It could be chemical agents like tear gas, pepper spray, impact weapons, batons. Also, you may have improvised impact weapons, like something that can be commonly used, a flashlight. I've seen law enforcement and corrections both have used flashlights as improvised batons. Even radios can be used. You also have in this category conductive energy devices, which those are stun guns, tasers, shock shields, anything that's using electricity. These do cause injury, as well as they do temporarily disable the subject, but it's not permanent. Now, the use of these weapons, they're justified when your lower levels, your empty hand control techniques, you know, soft and hard, have failed, or they're deemed insufficient. But they're also used in circumstances where using deadly force, it's not justified yet. Now, the last level, and this is the highest one, is deadly force. It also is called lethal force. Really, it's going to vary dependent on department to department, as well as like state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on what they call it. But this is any force that may cause serious bodily injury or death to the subject. Now, it's justified to prevent the subject from causing or continuing to cause serious bodily injury or death to the officer as well as to others. Also, it can be used to prevent the escape of someone that has caused serious bodily injury or death to another. So like if somebody just shot someone and then they're taking off, law enforcement is authorized to use deadly force at that point. Now, corrections does have additional justifications, such as when I work corrections, if we had an inmate that was escaping, we could use deadly force. Like if the most correctional facilities, like your prisons, for example, have a double fence as your exterior fence, we could use deadly force if the inmate is climbing that inner fence and is demonstrated they can do it and get over the exterior. So, I mean, we're given limits on that. Or we could also use deadly force if there's like to prevent mass destruction of property. Like if you've got inmates trying to burn down a housing unit. But in most cases, deadly force, you're going to use it to prevent a subject from causing serious bodily injury or death to yourself and others, or that person's already done it. Now that we've talked about really the techniques the officer uses, what those levels of force are, we need to actually now look at what the subject's doing and the levels of resistance. Because later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about really how your levels of force match up with your levels of resistance to help the officer figure out, okay, the subject's doing this. I'm authorized to respond by doing either this or this. Now, your first level of resistance, and again, this is what the subject's doing. You know, the arrestee, pretrial detainee, inmate, probation, or parolee, etc. The first is psychological intimidation. Now, these are non-verbal cues that indicate really the subject's attitude, appearance, and physical readiness. When I work corrections, I'm 5'3" and a female. I worked in all male facilities. I oftentimes had male inmates that would use this psychological intimidation. You know, they'd puff out their chest, they'd tense up their muscles, they'd get a growly expression on their face, all trying to intimidate me because I'm small and I'm a female. Did it work? No. But a lot of times you'll have subjects, they'll do this. You know, basically trying to look all big and bad, trying to intimidate you. Your next level, and oftentimes, if they're doing level 2, they're doing level 1 with it. Verbal non-compliance. This is any verbal response that's indicating they're not going to obey commands. They're not going to stop your behavior. Like, F you, cop, you're not taking me in. That kind of stuff. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, well, I'm not going to comply. A lot of times, if they're telling you to F off, that's verbal non-compliance. They're showing that they're not going to comply with what you're saying. Your next level is passive resistance. Now, that's any type of resistance where the subject, they're not trying to defeat the officer trying to control them. They're not being assaultive, but they're not voluntarily complying with directives or attempts of the officer trying to control them. Examples are dead weight, failing to react to commands. Like with dead weight, when I was working corrections, we had an inmate that was refusing to leave the caseworker's office. He ended up just laying on the floor. Didn't move. Wasn't listening to commands to get up. Passive resistance. Or you'll be escorting a subject and they go limp and you've got to drag them. Passive resistance. Or they are just standing there and just ignoring you. Passive resistance. Basically, with passive resistance, they're not complying, but they're not doing anything really to go against you. They're just not they're just basically kind of really not doing anything. So as they're not complying, but they're not doing anything to go against you. Like I said, pretty good examples, dead weight or just ignoring you. Now we're getting into where they're actually doing something. Defensive resistance is any action from the subject that attempts to prevent the officer from gaining control, such as they're pulling away. Like you go to handcuff them, and which handcuffing, in all but a very few cases, you're going to handcuff behind the back. Even I worked corrections for a number of years. The only time I've handcuffed in the front was we had an inmate that had a trach. And for medical and safety reasons, he had to be handcuffed in the front. So in case his trach clogged, he could clear it. I've also seen where a pregnant female has been handcuffed in front but she was very, very pregnant. And it was one of those, if she fell, she couldn't stop herself and she would injure her belly. So there's very, very few circumstances you will ever handcuff in front, just to let you know. I mean, granted, if you have like a belly chain, you will, but most cases, if it's just regular handcuffs, you're doing it behind the back. But let's say you are handcuffing someone. They don't want to be handcuffed. They end up pulling away from you, pulling the wrist out of your hand. That's defensive resistance. Or let's say they turn around and run away from you. That's defensive resistance. They're not doing anything assaultive towards you, but their actions, they're not having it. So they're doing something to basically prevent you from getting control of them. Like I said, pulling away, or even when you're escorting them. Like I've had inmates that I've escorted that they were handcuffed. And when we escorted, we always grabbed on to one of their upper arms. Reason why we did that, one, so we could control them. Like if they tried to pull away, bang, we could bring them in and use force if it was necessary. Also, we had control of them too. If I've never had this happen, but I had coworkers that this happened with. They were escorting an inmate that was handcuffed, and another inmate came up and tried to assault the inmate. So you grab onto the arm, where if another inmate's going to try to come up and assault that inmate, you can move the handcuffed inmate out of the way. Also, too, the reason why we end up grabbing the upper arm is if you're handcuffed behind your back, if you fall, you can't catch yourself. So it's also to prevent the person from falling and getting hurt. But I've had an inmate where I was escorting and they started pulling away. That's defensive resistance. Your next level, and this is actually, now we're getting into the assaultive levels. Active aggression. This includes physical actions, assaults against the officer or another individual, such as kicking, biting, grabbing, wrestling, etc. Now, we're not at really high chance of serious bodily injury or death yet, but they're going to be causing injury. So this is where they're starting to do the assault actions. Now, your next is aggravated active aggression or deadly force assault. this is your big one where they are being majorly assaultive, where there's a chance of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or another individual. Like, let's say they end up trying to choke you. That's aggravated active aggression or deadly force assault. The two names are pretty synonymous because if they're trying to choke you, there's a high chance of serious bodily injury or death. I had a student some years back that she was murdered by an inmate, and he ended up jumping on her back and choked her, and it killed her. So yeah, if they use anything like a chokehold, that's deadly force assault right there. But also they could have a weapon as well, gun, knife, whatever. So with this, it's serious assault or the presence of a weapon, and they're trying to cause major damage or death. Now, you're probably wondering after this, okay, well, how does the level of force and the levels of resistance actually kind of come together? Now that we've talked about, what me as an officer could do and what the subject does, how does that actually mesh? That's through the use of force continuum. Every department will have a use of force continuum. You'll have also a lot of jurisdictions will have a use of force continuum. Like the state might have a use of force continuum, and then every department will have one within that state. Also, every defensive tactic system, PPCT, Krav Maga, whatever, will have its own use of force continuum built in. But really what a use of force continuum is it's the relationship between the force the officer uses to gain compliance of the subject and the level of resistance exhibited by the subject. So that's where now you've got that crossing going on. Now, there's two theories when it comes to the use of force continuum on really the relationship between the force the officer uses and the resistance the subject exhibits. And the first one is the 1+1 theory. Now, it's based on proportionality, that the level of force has to be proportional with the level of resistance. Which this is really common, but with 1+1, they're taking proportionality up a notch, which they're saying that your level of control needs to be at or one level higher than the subject's level of resistance. So it's still proportional, but they're going, hey, you're taking it up just a smidge. The next theory is escalation, de-escalation, which, like I said before, with the 1+1, it's proportional, but your level of control is one step higher than the subject's level of resistance. In most cases, there's some where it's going to be the same. But with escalation, de-escalation, again, there is that proportionality element, but it states that as the subject's resistance level increases and decreases, your level of control needs to decrease or increase in relation. So if you combine the two theories together, it's basically saying, which oftentimes it is combined together, it's stating that, hey, your level of control needs to be in direct proportion with the subject's level of resistance. You're going one level above. As their resistance increases or decreases, you've got to increase or decrease your level of control, your level of force, in relation. Like, for example, the George Floyd case. Now, I'm not going to like go into what was going on before the incident that was caught on tape. I'm not sure if that neck restraint was initially warranted or not, because I haven't seen all the videos to know if the officers initially applying that neck restraint, if it was warranted. That I'm not sure, and I'm not going to go into that. However, when Floyd was compliant, he was handcuffed, he was on the ground, you had other officers that were there. That officer, and it was even in Minneapolis PD policy at the time. Although I will note their policy regarding the neck restraint had a lot of holes, and there were issues with them not properly training their officers in that policy. But in their neck restraint policy, it said that once a subject becomes compliant, you've got to take it off. You could still like somewhat keep it there, but you can't have that pressure. Where Floyd became compliant, that officer should have taken that neck restraint off, and he didn't. Now, there's other issues with that as well, because if I'm remembering correctly, I know with their neck restraint policy, I believe they said that you were not able to use your knee and go down on the subject's neck. But as I said, once Floyd was compliant, which he was during that main video, that officer should have taken that restraint off. He didn't. Now, if Floyd became resistant again and it got to the level where that neck restraint could be applied, then that officer could have reapplied it. But with him being compliant, he should have de-escalated, and he didn't. Now, I'll just show you, this is what the use of force continuum for PPCT looks like. Because I know the way I've been talking, and I did the levels of control and the levels of resistance separate, you're probably not able to really visualize that relationship. So here it is. So you've got on the right side, the levels of control, going from officer presence, clear up to deadly force. Left side, you've got the levels of resistance from psychological intimidation, clear up to your deadly force assault, aggravated active aggression. And the arrows indicate really where everything will fall. So you could see for officer presence, you could use it for psychological intimidation. Just say, don't worry, I'll go back. You could use it for psychological intimidation. You could use it for verbal noncompliance. Also passive resistance, soft empty hand control, passive resistance or defensive resistance, hard empty hand, defensive resistance, active aggression, intermediate weapons, active aggression, as well as your lower end of deadly force assault. You can use an intermediate weapon. So like if they've got a knife and they're like, you know, like from a distance trying to stab, yeah, you could hit them with a baton or you could hit them with a taser. And then obviously deadly force, you're going to be matching with a deadly force assault. So you could see for PPCT, here's the continuum. Now, depending on the defensive tactics system, this continuum is going to look different. Krav Maga's got its own continuum. Jiu-Jitsu's got its own continuum. So depending on what system a department uses, their continuum is going to look different. because their continuum is going to be based on that system. Now, really, when you're in a situation where you might be using force, you've got to conduct a quick assessment of the situation to determine what the subject's doing, what their level of resistance is. And then, okay, their level of resistance is here. My level of control needs to be here. Law enforcement, corrections, as well as private security and the military receive substantial training and uses of force. Classroom training where you're learning statute, case law, regulations, things like that. You're learning terminology, basically book work. Then you're having practical where you're actually learning the techniques and using them. Now, the training used to just stop there. And they were finding officers with both law enforcement and corrections, because the practical training didn't include real life scenarios that they're going to be facing on the job. If they do end up having a use of force encounter, that officers, it was taking too long to do the assessment. The assessment should be like that, where it was taking too long. It's like, oh crap, the person's doing this. What do I do? So the training over the past decade or so now is scenario based. Well, they'll have a trainer in protective gear pretend to be a subject. So those of you that end up going to law enforcement corrections, when they do the scenario part, you're gonna probably have your trainer get a little nasty with you. Kind of calling you names, cursing and stuff, but they're trying to emulate a real life situation. And they're gonna vary it up. They're not gonna tell you, oh, well, hey, I'm gonna do this and this, and you've got to respond this way. They're just gonna go, and you'll have to conduct that assessment and act. But you'll get substantial training to where when you encounter a use of force situation, being able to conduct that assessment of the subject, the immediate surroundings, as well as the bigger surroundings, it's going to be like the snap of a finger. It's going to be instantaneous. And you want to get it to where it's that point. If it's not, you can end up getting hurt or killed. So definitely, if you get to where, you're like, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure what to do in this situation, go train. Get with your department's training instructor, go, hey, I kind of forgot what I'm supposed to do in this situation. Could we do a little bit of training on it? They'll probably be okay with it. But you want to make sure between the lecture, the practical, and the scenario, you've got it down to instinct. Like I said, it's your life, basically. You want this instinct. Now, there's some variables that are going to affect your assessment and really the level of control you're going to be using in response to the subject's level of resistance. The type of crime committed or attempted. Like I said before, with school shootings, because that person is in that building for the sole purpose of killing as many people as they can, initial law enforcement that goes in, they're going to find the person to stop them. See, deadly force, you're not using it to kill someone. You're using it to stop them, to stop their non-compliance, to stop their actions. I just want to make that clear because if you're law enforcement or corrections and you've had to use deadly force and you get on the stand and say that your sole purpose was to kill that person, you're probably going to get into trouble. So you need to say, I felt, given the circumstances, deadly force was necessary to stop the individual. But with like school shootings, because of that person's intent, deadly force is going to be your go-to. Where if you got like maybe somebody that's in a school that is just kind of running amok, like maybe you've got a fight going on between some students, you're not going to go deadly. So it's gonna depend on really what's occurring. Also, your size and strength compared to the subjects. With me working male facilities and being a female that was 5'3", I was authorized to use more force than what most of the male staff were because of my size and strength in relation to the inmates. So there were times like if I had to use force against an inmate, I'm having to where a male staff might do 2 maneuvers. Because of my size, I might be having to do 4. So I do urge you, if you are planning on going into the criminal justice field or even the military, where you're going to be using force, don't just partner up with someone that's your gender, that's your size. Partner up with someone smaller, partner up with someone bigger, partner up with different genders. That way, you're learning how you have to adapt. I always partnered up with males that were bigger than me because most of the inmates I was supervising bigger than me. So I was able to learn by doing that. Okay, my size, this maneuver is not going to be my go-to because my arms are too short. And for me to actually be able to hit this, I'm going to be getting too close to the inmate and I'm going to be in a very vulnerable position that I'm going to end up getting hurt. So if I want to use this maneuver, I'm going to have to use this different maneuver first. So yeah, partner up with different sizes when you're doing training. That way you can learn the adaptations. So when you're in the field, you're not going, oh crap, I don't know what to do. Also, the number of subjects and officers involved. I was in pre-service when this took place. The facility I worked at in Nebraska, and this was when I was still in the academy, they had a large disturbance in the gym. Multiple inmates in there fighting, staff had gotten majorly assaulted. We had a female staff who she had a black belt in either Taekwondo or Jiu-Jitsu. Our system was PPCT. Per policy, that's what she was supposed to be utilizing. But she was going up against, I think it was like 4 inmates. And she did a quick assessment. I'm like, oh, this isn't going to work. I'm going up against 4 people. She ended up using the martial art that she had the black belt in. Did not get in trouble for it. Where if you've got a lot of officers that are going against very few subjects and you're using a lot of force, that is going to be considered excessive and improper. So it's going to, like I said, it's going to depend upon the number of subjects, the number of officers involved. If we look at the Capitol riot, those officers were significantly outnumbered, as well as they did have some of the protesters were using deadly force against the officers. In that situation, the officers were authorized to use deadly force. and to completely go outside the use of force continuum because it was, hey, you're outnumbered. You've got to go outside the use of force continuum and do what you got to do, or you're going to get killed. Another thing that needs to be taken into consideration is availability of backup. Now, a lot of your like bigger city PDs, like let's say Torrington, Scottsbluff, for example, you've got enough officers on duty. If crap hits the fan, you've got help that's going to be coming. But think about if you're working for a smaller city where you're the only one on duty and your on-call person they're at home, or your backup is like the sheriff's department and goodness knows where they are, or your sheriff's deputy and you're patrolling where you're not near a town. State patrol is another one. You may be out in the middle of nowhere and end up getting into a situation and your backup is pretty far away. Or corrections. Some of your smaller departments, you may not have much backup coming. Presence of weapons. If they have a knife, a gun, I will say, and this is going to occur especially in corrections, anything can be used as a weapon. Also the exceptional abilities and skills of the subject. If you have someone that's like super big and strong, that's like a martial arts expert, your force is going to be looking a little bit different. Now, I do want to talk about a situation that really some of these variables are actually going to be coming into play. Now, we had one where it was a planned use of force. So we had a group of staff that they were in the protective equipment, which I do need to note, just because a use of force is planned, that doesn't mean it's routine. That doesn't mean it's going to go normal. They never go according to plan, just to let you know. But we had, force cell team. An inmate had a pen that he was trying to use as a weapon against the staff. One of the corporals ended up hitting the inmate in the face. He got nailed with excessive use of force. And the reason why he did, which I believe he ended up getting fired for it, reason why he got in trouble for it was they said, yes, the inmate had a weapon, a pen. Because again, anything could be used as a weapon. And he was actually using it as a weapon, but they were like, you've got yourself and 4 other staff that are on that force cell team. You also had other staff that were on the gallery. And the 5 of you are wearing protective equipment. That, no, it's not going to fly that you hit the inmate. Other factors, injury exhaustion of the officer. You may end up having a use of force situation that's going on forever to where you're getting majorly tired. You may end up having to go up in force because it's like, hey, if I get to where I can't do anything anymore, I'm going to get killed. Influence of alcohol or drugs the subject is taken. Depending on the substance, they could get super strong. You may have things that won't work on them. Like you may end up hitting them with a taser and they're not going down because they're so piped up on a substance that they're not feeling anything. Another variable, immediacy of the danger. School shootings are a prime example of that. Special knowledge the officer has of the subject. You may have special knowledge about the subject as well as the situation going into the use of force that is going to influence what you're doing. Like if you end up going on, let's say, a noise complaint to a house, and you've responded to this house before for domestics, your response is going to be a little bit different. Distance between the officer and the subject. If you have a subject that is like 30 feet away, running at you with a knife, that's not imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. You will probably get in trouble if you use deadly force in that situation. But if they're right up on you, that's a big difference. Also, weather and terrain. So you've got a lot of variables that are going to affect you conducting that assessment and what you're going to be doing. With use of force situations, you are constantly reassessing. It's constant. Now, one thing I will state, and those of you going into the criminal justice related fields where you will be using force, you've got to be training for this. In a use of force situation, your perception majorly narrows. You've got to keep it from narrowing because you've got to be paying attention to not only what's going on with the subject, but as well as your immediate surroundings and even your bigger ones. It's like corrections, for example. If you got a use of force situation with an inmate in a housing unit, you better be paying attention until you get back up there. You better be paying attention to what the other inmates are doing and kind of keep an eyeball to kind of like just kind of, kind of keep your eyes bouncing. It's like, okay, am I getting surrounded by a bunch of other inmates? Now, I've already touched on this. There are times where force is going to be improper and excessive, where you're not authorized to do it or do it the way you did it. Improper, excessive force, application of force in situations that it's not justified. Also, force in excess of what is needed to gain control of the situation, compliance of the subject, and stop the subject's actions. So again, what happened with George Floyd? I'm not sure what happened previously that caused that officer to apply the neck restraint. However, once Floyd was compliant, that neck restraint should have been taken off, and it wasn't, and it was excessive because it wasn't taken off. Techniques outside the officer's training and department policy and procedure. Again, the example I used of that female officer, technically that would be excessive force. However, given the fact that there were multiple inmates in the gym, very few staff, I mean, there were a couple of, I think there were like at least 100 in the gym. Some were compliant, some weren't. But this particular officer, she was going up against 4 inmates who were very much intended to assault her. She was justified in going outside of her training. So any of that is excessive force. So I hope all of you enjoyed the presentation. I'm not going to be going into case law or anything like that just because that's going to take too much time. But I hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to contact me. Take care and stay safe out there.